Hello everyone, my name is Tom Dodge, and I'm honored to welcome you to Creating the World We Want, a video podcast dedicated to discussing and analyzing the underlying issues in our society in order for us to build collectively together to create the world we want. I'm here with my co-host Bob Massey, and we're honored to welcome our guest, Councilor Lydia Edwards, to our show today.
I am so excited to have you, Councilor. We have met over the last year or so, but I have been aware of your career and of your powerful leadership. And I just want to start with a real quick story about Councilor Edwards. I ran for governor, as many of you know. We had a very challenging and interesting debate on gender issues and women's rights, and Councilor Edwards was the moderator. And so we went in, the three guys who were running for governor, and she asked a question of one of us, and then I thought, well, this is a great question. I'm going to get ready to answer the question even better. And then she would switch and give me a totally different question. So I had to scramble, and she really made me think, and she made me work. And then similarly, all the way through that debate, you had an individual question for each of us. And I was very struck by that was the only time that happened. The questions were the best of the whole campaign and really helped me understand just something about the way your mind works and the drive that you have to push people to go the extra mile. So in the course of the next hour or so, we have the privilege of learning more about Councilor Edwards, about her background, about what she's working on, about what we can help. And then at the end, we really want to go deeper. We hope we go deeper the whole time, but really in how can we all come together to create the world we want and to address the problems that are so often left out of our public dialogue. So, Councilor, thank you so much for being here. We're excited to have you.
Thank you. This is a great opportunity. I appreciate the conversation.
And we, like to just get to know people, where they're from, and what were the life conditions, values, passions that formed the kind of public leader that you obviously have become. So could you talk to us a little bit about your childhood and things that mattered to you when you were a girl?
I'm a military brat. My mother was in the Air Force, and so she raised myself and my twin sister as a single mom. I think that was pretty formative growing up on military bases, just being there, and there's a level of community that you have one thing in common with everybody that lives in your area. The other thing is, I think, growing up on military bases, they assign housing based on rank. Mm-hmm. So I had a very integrated neighborhood, no matter where I went. So across the street, African Americans, there's Mexican Americans, Korean Americans, Jewish Americans, and I didn't realize what a privilege and what a unique childhood that would have been, as most Americans did not grow up in very integrated neighborhoods. So it was a beautiful thing. It was a rare thing to have. There was a sense of cohesion that a lot of neighborhoods that you have to have after years of being in a neighborhood that I just had instantly when you moved in to the military base. It also makes you very culturally, you're able to adjust very quickly to new things, to new people, to new languages, and I think that's a strength that I have. And being able to come into neighborhoods, meet people, it was how I grew up. So every school year, you might be in a different school, or you had new friends automatically, and I think that that's a strength. So I look back on that childhood, having my mother being in the military, the one who wore the combat boots before it was cool for folks to wear, or women especially, wear combat boots. To have that kind of strength and not see it as anything demeaning or anything making me less of a woman, to be the breadwinner, to be the strongest person in the household. And then being in a very integrated classroom or very integrated base, and then having an automatic connection with folks, I think that those were very, very influential and impactful for me.
One of the interesting things that I think we'll talk about as we move forward, but that theme of wanting to understand what are the key elements to really create a sense of community and cooperation and so forth seems something that's moved forward through your career even now into your time as city councilor, and it's a careful, complicated process to build a community. And so as you were observing all of that, did you have a sense of, I want to be a lawyer right away, or did you ease into it through some kind of social justice work, or what was the pathway?
I remember wanting to be a police officer, then an FBI agent, and then a lawyer. Really, it stuck in my mind after seeing Separate but Equal with Sidney Poitier, who was portraying Thurgood Marshall. And there was a TBS special at the time. You would videotape them right on your VHS, and my sister and I watched it over and over again. And that was such a defining, beautiful moment for this country. And to see, at the time especially, incredibly articulate, intelligent African Americans on TV doing historic work. And to see, I mean, Sidney Poitier in and of himself, he's an icon. And so it was so impactful for me. I wanted to be Thurgood Marshall. I wanted to be in the room and to be that advocate.
Very cool. So this, as you touched on, this theme of solidarity, you know, it's something that's really shown through the show. It's been really encouraging to us. What transitioned you, like what did you learn in school, I would say, that really inspired you to want to fight for justice?
Or outside of school.
Yeah, I don't know that I mean, in school, I can't think of any defining moments in school. I would say that, you know, my teachers were amazing. I was blessed to have incredible teachers, all public school or DOD, Department of Defense schools when we were in England. And my teachers were, especially in that small town of Gwinn, Michigan, which is where my mother moved there after leaving the Air Force Base. Those teachers they were there for me. I remember when I was a finalist for a scholarship, and you had to do the interview in Lansing, Michigan, and that's about 8 or 9 hours away from where I live. And so at the time, my mother was working 2 jobs, and one of the jobs paid minimum wage, which is $5.15 an hour. So what that means if you have to get your kid across the state and get a hotel room is that you're gonna have to miss work. And she couldn't afford to. So I remember telling her name's Miss Koski now, DeChambeau at the time, trying to figure out how to do the interview via phone or written, because I can't get down there and I'm a finalist in the state. And she said, "Is that all you need, is to get down there?" And I said, "Yes." So Miss Koski got a substitute teacher, put me in her car and drove me down there and got the hotel room so that I could make my interview, and I got the scholarship. So it's those formative moments where people put in for my family when we were growing up and we were struggling financially. Someone, to this day I don't know who, they signed the letters anonymous, or they actually signed the letters your guardian angel donated to my family in our mailbox. And so when you are in a small town and someone's believing in you that much, that they're donating and making sure that your family has the resources that we needed at the time, those are formative moments that you want to pay forward one day.
That's amazing. I guess following it up, necessarily not with experiences, but like learning lessons from your like political science major and stuff like that. Were there anything revealed to you? I remember wanting to be a political science major because I was fearful that the traditional education structure wasn't teaching us about what was going on in civics as much as need to, you know? Like, was there any lessons you learned in that school, or like whether your first initial jobs and stuff like that, that taught you the structural system of our society isn't necessarily where it needs to be?
I don't think I got to those lessons. Well, no, let me be clear. I don't think you're ever free to be privileged to be unaware of that if you are a person of color, if you're a woman, that the structural system isn't necessarily made for you. I don't think you ever escape that. So there is no grand awakening for a lot of us. We kind of are told through microaggressions and through other ways throughout your life. That being said, in terms of what politics or organizing could do to that, I don't think I really got that connection until later in life.
What was there a first experience that kind of like pushed you into that moment?
Yeah, I was working at the Brazilian Immigrant Center.
Oh, right.
I began organizing undocumented immigrants and began to understand the limitations of my JD, that if you go into court with someone who is a domestic worker and by law she's not actually considered a worker, for rights purposes, you got none through the traditional systemic value or pathway through the legal system. She's not considered a worker. So we knew.
Meaning that to be considered a worker, you need a steady employment with paying benefits or paying into?
By virtue of the state law at the time said that discrimination laws only apply to certain workers. You had to have at least 6 people on site, which most domestic workers work by themselves, but it also actually excluded those in the domestic service of another. That's a quote. So you do not have protection against racial discrimination, against gender discrimination, against sexual orientation discrimination. You could be fired because you were not of the same religion of the family that you're trying to work for. That was as of 2014 in Massachusetts. So the other components of denying a person's work status without outright saying it is simply saying you're not valued, we're not going to pay you for all the work that you work. You're a glorified babysitter. Your work isn't skilled. It's essentially women's work, and it was following on the same historic pattern that we took on since the New Deal. As very clear that in the New Deal was a wonderful thing for many workers, giving us minimum wage, overtime, OSHA protections, but it was also a negotiated deal with the South. They would not sign on if farm workers and domestic workers were included. So you look at the agrarian society in the 1930s, 40s, who were those workers? They were African Americans. They were 2, maybe 3 generations away from slavery. The entire economy of the South was dependent on African American labor since slavery, but even up until the New Deal. So they were excluded. And so to continue that was to us continuing a vestige of slavery and excluding domestic workers from full workers' rights and recognition, even in Massachusetts.
So the work for the Massachusetts Coalition for Domestic Workers, if I have the name correctly, that came and really, in addition to the Brazilian experience, that kind of plunged you into the immediacy and urgency of those failures, the consequences of those legal failures.
It plunged me into organizing for those failures.
Could you just remind us what year that was?
That was, let's see, I got into the Brazilian Immigrant Center in 2009 as a board member. I really got into working there and opening up a legal clinic later, early 2000 and, I want to say, was it 2010, 11? But I was on the board and organizing, volunteering for them. And then the domestic worker movement, it really helped that New York had just passed a domestic worker bill of rights. It kind of looked at us and we said, okay, this is something that we might have to do. And so looking at all the laws and seeing the exemptions from domestic workers throughout Massachusetts law, those in the domestic service of another, right? We realized if the system is set up in such a way, there is no other response besides to change it. We had to change the law.
Those New York laws came out of New York City or out of New York State?
First there was a domestic worker bill of rights in the city, and then they got it passed at the state level. So
I'd like to move us into your decision to run for city council. So as I observed the race from faraway Somerville, and I thought it was a bold move to jump in, and we'll talk a little bit about what an extraordinary district you have with very different communities and histories. If you could just take us back to your thinking, here I'm going to jump into this, win or lose, let's see what happens. I mean, help us. As somebody who's jumped into races myself, there's a sort of interesting moment at the beginning where you think, well, I think this is worth doing. So tell us a little bit about that decision to run.
I think the decision to run really came in 2016 when I ran for the Senate seat in a special election. So the lead sponsor for the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights was Anthony Petrocelli, who was my senator. So that's how I got to know a lot of the State House and understanding how it moves. I was the lead lobbyist for the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. We didn't have money for anybody else, essentially. So, but I got on-the-job training in a good way, and we got a unanimous Senate. All the Republicans crossed over, and we had a supermajority in the House. And that had a lot to do with knowing narratives, being able to read a room, being able to figure out how to connect. And again, I think that goes back to being an Air Force brat and being able to sit down and read and understand what someone's values are and what they actually need to hear from you, not necessarily the same dogmatic kind of, pitch that a lot of people have been trained to give. So, so when Senator Petrocelli, he decided to step down, I was like 2 years after we passed the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. 2014 we passed it, 2015, so the next year he decides to step down in December. And enough folks had suggested that I run, and they said it's an opportunity, a special election's an opportunity. And it was the most, I would think that decision was the most frightening, to figure out what it means to run. I had no idea how to put a campaign together. I had no idea, or at least I thought, right? Here I just did a statewide campaign, and I was like, I don't know anything about this. And so there are a lot of really good folks who kind of nudged me, pushed me, and said, you should do it. So that was the hardest decision. And getting in it, there were several times I'm like, what am I doing? And but I was constantly inspired by the amount of folks who came out and knocked on doors for me, who I met through the movement, who I met through the center, the nannies that I had represented, to come and support. And I think that decision to run was the real decision to run. I did not win that race, but I did win East Boston, which was a surprise to a lot of folks. So I went to work in housing for the mayor, Mayor Walsh, and then the next year, 2017, is when Sal Lamatina, the city councilor, said I'm stepping down, and that decision was very easy to make. The geography made sense. I lived in East Boston. East Boston was the largest component of the district. I had just knocked on those doors a year ago, and so I knew where my supporters were. I knew where I can grow in my supporters. So I said, I'm definitely running.
So what did you learn about that first run for Senate?
Hang on, even before we get that, go ahead. Because I want to go a little deeper on the city council thing, but go ahead.
So what did you learn from that campaign, and I guess working in the mayor's office, from a movement building perspective, that you kind of created this campaign team? Like, what did you ensure from the beginning of setting up this campaign that you were going to instill from those lessons learned?
I knew it had everything to do with the connection. And I knew because I think I came in fourth, but the person who raised the most money came in, of the candidates, I think that person came in last. So I learned that it was not about how much you can raise in terms of dollars, it's how much you can raise in terms of an army of door knockers. And so we hit those doors, and I knew that that's how you're going to win, a grassroots movement based off a consistent message that is transparent, that speaks to a person's needs and realities, and that is consistent. So be truthful about be truthful about who you are and what you're going to do, and people will recognize as real. And that's across race lines, that's across language, that's across a lot of different divisions that I think a lot of the pollsters and a lot of the Politico insiders don't recognize or are too lazy to go deep into. They're not the ones on the doors, and they never will be on the doors.
Yeah. That was a really good question, and where I was going to go is not everyone who may be watching or listening knows the character of some of these different areas. So I'd like, just because Boston's such an interesting place, and you have three particularly interesting places, so maybe we should talk just briefly about East Boston, about Charlestown. I could see that having a base and having gone around, was Charlestown a particular challenge? Was the North End a particular challenge, or did you? As communities that had supported Italian candidates for a long time, you're stepping into three related but still distinct communities. Tell us a little bit about them and how you approach them.
So I represent East Boston, Charlestown, and part of the North End. And they do have unique histories and unique forms of neighborhoods. They're consistent, though, in that a Boston neighborhood kind of has several components, right? You have the guys who are in the politics or think they're in the politics. You have a large amount of gentrification. You have an old versus new sense within Boston in general, but also down at the neighborhood level. What's the character of the city? There's the challenges with development. There have always been challenges with immigrants coming in. It just depended on the wave. And East Boston in particular has been, I think it was only second to Ellis Island for the amount of immigrants who came into the United States. And so it had, I think, many, many years ago, we still have a cemetery, actually, a Jewish cemetery. So Russian Orthodox Jews were, I think, I think it was the largest population of immigrants, and then came Irish. There was a wave of Irish individuals coming in, and then the Italians, and now we're dealing with a wave of Central Americans and the Latinos, Latinx coming in as well. So it's always been immigrant haven in East Boston, and now we're dealing with, I think, a level of gentrification that we're not used to seeing. But all three neighborhoods are dealing with those kinds of challenges. So the more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. And so I think one of the challenges of anybody who is not from Boston or may not be typical or expected is that you have to get over the narrative that people want to write for you and also want to write for the neighborhoods that you represent. So saying that, a black woman could never win or do well in Charlestown, that's a narrative that was written for me, and that was also a narrative unfairly written for Charlestown. Same for East Boston and even the North End. And so you have to write your own narrative. You have to meet your constituents, and they needed to know me. And I think that is what I learned. It is the thousands of doors that I knocked on personally to meet, to shake hands in the hot sun, throughout that summer, that I think I earned Charlestown, I earned the North End, and I earned East Boston.
That's amazing. I can see the authenticity shining through just in this quick conversation, so I'm sure that's why people really believed in you.